Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Geopolitics with Tyberius D. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the most momentous events in all of world history, that being the horde conflict of the Great War of 1914 and 1918, otherwise known today as World War One. Roll the intro. Alright, it's good to see everybody back, and I hope you all are doing well. We are still doing the live recording of these, so if you ever want to chime in with from the audience, you're very welcome to do so. Alright, so what is World War One? What is going on here? Well, in a nutshell, is that this has been the better part of 300 years of basically imperial struggle between everybody that was going on, and this is basically the end of the era for the most part. Now, of course, we've already talked about World War II and how this is more or less, or World War II is more or less the end of the imperial era because only two will remain, and it basically is divided between the Americans and the Soviets when it's all said and done. But World War I is where everything really goes off the rails. So let's get our backdrop here because we haven't talked about the events going forward, and then we'll talk about how it all ends. So, for the better part of about 300, 400 years at this point, is that the imperial powers of Europe have all been struggling with each other for supremacy. This is because, I'll put it this way. You've got England, you've got France, you had Spain, and, eventually what will be Germany, and eventually what will be Italy, and all of these different ethnic groups and empires that are all competing for resources and markets and all of these things going on. And at one time, it looked like the Spanish was winning with the Great Spanish Empire. You had the rise of Austria and just kicking ass, taking names. You had the Ottomans for a good while. Everyone's had their time to shine to some degree by this point. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody's still here. Russia's had a really good run about 100, 200 years before under Peter the Great and even under Catherine. You've had the Victorian age, which has just ended, which is pretty much just Britain's golden age for them. France had always been kind of struggling, but under the age of Napoleon 100 years before, they were able to basically almost 1v Europe and win. And so, in a nutshell, everybody's had their golden age to shine. But there's two new kids on the block. One of them is incredibly powerful and proficient. One of them is kind of just weird. That is obviously Germany and Italy. Now, long story short here is that Germany had largely been represented by both the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Empire as basically the front of the Germans. And they've succeeded in this to some degree more or less decently. But as the rise of the northern Germans, particularly Prussia, came along, is that eventually you have a largely, almost exclusively German state that is in the center of Europe, that is geopolitically sensitive because it's smack dab between Russia and France, literally borders Russia and France, but is not in a particularly good spot, geopolitically to defend itself, but it's strong. It's stupidly strong. All of these German states that have been vying against each other for the better part of 200 or 300 years outside of Austria have now been coalesced into one entity. And the reason why this area was so hard to rule is because it's pretty damn powerful. And now that it's all in one setup, the economy of scale takes off. And Germany is, while largely the second most populated country within the Europe at the time, it's the number one economic powerhouse within Europe. And it rivals almost the British Empire. Of all of it, almost rivals the British Empire. It's strong. It's powerful. It's competent. It kicks ass. And the worst part for most people is it's young. It's the new kid on the block, and it's a big threat. Italy is in a bit of a different situation. I don't want to shit on the Italians, but their economy's always been really weird. It's always lagging behind most of Europe, even on a good day. It's not interconnected to the same degree, and basically if it isn't the Po River Valley, that being Venice and Milan, and largely maybe even Genoa, is that it doesn't integrate with the rest of the Italian network very well. Rome is almost in a completely different country than northern Italy, and if you get down to Naples and you get into Sardinia and Sicily, forget it. You're talking about a completely different entity entirely. So the problem is with Italy, is while it's new and it's largely been unified, it's not nearly as competent or structured or effective as Germany is. And there's a lot of things that boil into that. A couple of other notes. While there's a number of players at play here, we're down to 12 great powers. This is more or less the end of... this is more or less the end of a couple of them. Poland had there's about 15 throughout history that all really get into the great major geopolitical confrontations of the imperial era. But 3 of them are either dead or checked out. One being Poland, which had been basically wiped off the face of the earth about 100 years before. The next being Spain, which largely won't even participate in this. They're not having it. And there's one more, and I forget who it is. I apologize. I'm forgetting somebody. Somebody's going to be offended. Anyway, but all of the other players will participate in some degree. So, who are the final 12? Number 1, the United States of America. It is the new kid on the block as far as being a great power, because while it has just defeated Spain in a war, it's not really something to brag about. Spain's been on the decline for the better part of 100 to 200 years, so whatever. But everyone knows that its economy is one of the biggest in the world. It's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly huge, and it just lacks the military competency and build out to really force itself onto the world that many of the other European nations have, because the Americans really haven't been in the colonial game. They haven't been going to war with everybody. They haven't been fighting. Literally the biggest fight that the Americans had fought to this point was literally amongst themselves in the American Civil War. And the few escapades they've gone into that they've actually been involved with another great power was one, Britain 100 years before, or they were picking on their neighbors such as Mexico or Cuba, or well, not Cuba, but that's Spain, but largely Mexico or somebody else within the region. And so the Americans literally just had to build a small competent force, send it along its way, and they win. So the Americans really haven't militarily proved themselves, and they really haven't geopolitically asserted themselves into a wider world to a large degree. But they're changing. They've got a few people and a few leaders that are actively questioning how wise that was. And under a guy named Teddy Roosevelt, this starts becoming the policy that America is going to start playing a role, at least within the North American continent, and to a large degree within the Western Hemisphere. And so that for the United States, that changes. The next on the list is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is largely just exiting its golden age under the Victorian era. And it has a very strong, competent navy, that is the Royal Navy. Militarily, it's proved itself over and over again. Economically, the British Empire is the second biggest economy in the world, just behind the Americans as a functional entity. But it's divided, it's spread out. It's literally the sun never sets upon the British Empire, which is true. But you've got India and South Africa and Australia and New Zealand and Canada. This dominion is huge, and it's not actually all that geopolitically secure. You've got numerous ethnic divisions. You've got numerous political divisions, numerous religious divisions. This thing's really hard to hold together, and actually you're going to find out with this war that when Britain wants to hit anybody who is not, or basically anyone who is a developed Western nation that is on parity, they really have a hard time putting it over the top. To a large degree, what Britain's success has been is not been going in competence against their foreign European rivals, at least on land. It's largely been dealing with people that they would call the primitives or the uncivilized folk or what have you. And, you just go into Africa, colonize. You go into India, colonize. You go into China, colonize. This has largely been the British path to success for the better part of 100 years at this point. Now, I can get into, the Crimean War, I can get into the Boer War, I can get into all these things, but largely is that Britain has had a coalition with somebody to do most of their fighting for them for the better part of the last 300 years. It's very rare that Britain's actually gotten into a knockdown, drag-out fight and won it with somebody. So Britain has some issues here. Next is France. Now, France is pretty strong, pretty competent going into this war, but it's got a national scar for itself. 40 years before the war starts, they are decisively defeated by the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War, and they are pissed. And especially at the point where Prussia had formed during that war the German Empire, and now Germany is all united. It is strong, competent, and capable, and the French are scared shitless of it because they want revenge, but they're not sure exactly how capable they are at actually getting back at the Germans. And so a fight is stirring here between these two powers. Make no reservation about it. But the French are very nervous about actually what happens when that engagement happens. Next on the list is Germany. We already talked about Germany, so I'll skip it. After that, we have, good to see you in chat. After that, we have Austria. Austria is largely in a state of decline. Now, it's a large empire. It's very, it's powerful in scale, but in actual competency and effectiveness, it's really falling apart at this point. The rise of the last 100 years has been a very nationalistic fervor of ethnocentrism, where people want their own lands and their own sovereignty and their own independence. And this is the antithesis to the Austrian Empire. While the Austrian Empire is ruled by the Austrians, which are effectively Germans, is that they're only about 1/8 of the population, more or less. You have Slovaks, you have Czechs, you have Hungarians, you have Croats, you have Slovenians, you have Transylvanians, which will basically be Romanians and Hungarians. You have Bosnians, which will eventually be pulled into the war or pulled into the empire right before World War I starts. This is a huge multi-ethnic empire that for the last 100 years has had to deal with a striving increase in nationalism that is literally pulling the empire apart from the seams. And the only way they've even survived this damn long is that they actually had to give Hungary, the Hungarians, basically full and equal rights under the empire to be basically subservient partners to the Austrians. I don't know how that deal lasted for 70 years, but somehow it did, but this will be the end of it when it's all said and done anyway. So, Austria having some issues, and this will actually be the war that kills them. Getting next, you have the Ottomans. The Ottomans are in an absolute state of just disarray. They've lost most of their European territories. They've lost most of their Asian and African territories as well. They are on their last leg, and this will be the final foray for the Turks into history for the better part of 100 years. Everyone else is going to dictate the terms of what's going on with them after this war. And we'll get into this in the post. But they're basically on their last leg, and this will be the one that kills them off. Next is Russia. Russia has had some heydays where it has been strong and competent. It was largely the people that put most of the work into defeating Napoleon. But ever since then, it seems that they bled most of the cream of their crop in the fields of Europe, and they start to stagnate, and they start to go back and to become normal with what we've seen with Russian European history. Under people like Nicholas II is that they really haven't been able to push forward or get rid of their autocratic nature. And pushing forward reforms has been an absolute mess in Russia. Serfdom isn't gotten rid of until like 1868. And this is basically feudalism. And even with that, is that while first serfdom is supposed to be officially ended, it really isn't. And we have Russia going into World War I basically in a state of feudalism in the 20th century. It's not going to go well for them. All right, who do we got left? We have Japan, which is the arriving new kid on the block. They had actually just defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905-1906 decisively, and this is only 10 years before. And so Japan, new kid on the block, looking very confident, but honestly on the wrong side of the world, or at least maybe on the wrong team. We'll have to talk about that a little bit later. One thing about the Russians that I forgot to mention is that the Russians have their own national disdain because they have been defeated by the upstarts of the Japanese. And with this is that when it comes to the engagement of Serbia, which is not a great power, is that the Russians feel like they have to defend Serbia and they can't back down. And this is actually one of the big things that will lead up into the war. Who do we got left? China. China is in a state of more or less collapse at this point, or collapse and reformation. The Qing dynasty is on its last leg, or absolutely is, in the process of falling apart. This is one of those weird issues with the Taiping Rebellion and whatnot, and the Boxer Rebellion, is that China is here, but it's effectively a non-entity. It's largely been occupied by literally everybody under the sun and carved out their own spheres of influence. And honestly, I have trouble putting them even on the great powers list. They will participate in the war by largely going after the Central Powers, in particular Germany, and seizing their territorial possessions, but it doesn't do them much favor. Japan has the same problem. Basically, somebody should have sided with the Central Powers during this war, but they didn't. And so, let's see. United States, Italy, Germany, Russia, France, Britain, the Ottomans, Austria. I'm missing 4. China and Japan. I'm missing 2. Somebody can remind me in chat. I forget. Otherwise, I'll just start this up. No, it's 10. It's 8 great powers during World War II and 10 during this. Okay, gotcha. Okay, yeah, that's all 10. So we're at 10 going in. 2 of them are on their last, or one of them's on its absolute last leg. One of them is falling apart at the seams. Another one is old as hell. 2 of them are relatively new kids on the block, maybe even 3. And the others are kind of just there. So, what kicks this all off? Why is this going to happen? There was an incident back in 1910 called the Moroccan incident, where it looked like Germany and France was going to go to war then. Why didn't it happen? Well, to a large degree, is that everyone was itching for a fight to some instance, but everyone's afraid of, once you trigger these alliance systems, that everyone's going to get into the fight. That was a concern then. They didn't just walk into this, unconvincingly. What largely is going on here is that they know war is going to be expensive and it might be long, and everyone's just kind of flirting with danger because, to a large degree, people are like, all right, cool. We've got these new weapons called machine guns, and we've got all these new things where they're like, hey, let's go fight. We'll have the war in by Christmas. But there's also others that are cautioning that are like, look, we saw what happened with Napoleon. We saw what happened with all this stuff. All this new tech just makes the body count go up, and wars take sometimes longer. Sometimes there was examples of where this was true, such as the Franco-Prussian War that's over in 4 months. But other times there's examples where this is not true, such as the Crimean War, which takes the better part of 3 to 4 years. So some people are nervous. Don't let historians fool you. There was a lot of things on the plate here. Okay, what eventually does type this all off is that the heir to the Austrian throne, Franz von Ferdinand, is touring the empire. And he's quite a bit of a reformist, but a lot of people don't give him credit for this. He is basically inspecting one of the newer possessions to the empire, that is Bosnia, and he is in the capital Sarajevo, and he's trying to get a sense for what's going on. He's also doing a little bit of parade, or what is it? It's not a parade. I believe he's actually technically on vacation, truthfully, with his wife. I think they were celebrating something. But anyway, what largely happens is word gets out, and the Serbians, a Serbian group who believes in, I don't know if it's Pan-Slavism, but believes that the Bosnians are getting screwed by the Austrians. I did say that right. They want to kill him. And this is a secret group called the Black Hand. You probably all know the story, but in case you don't, is that they're a group that advocates for helping the Bosnians get independence from the Austrians, because this is just a recent development. I think they're Pan-Slavic to some degree. But they're definitely anarchists as well, too, which is weird. But anyway, they end up killing him. Gavrilo Princip and a few people get together, and they kill him. I'm not going to really get into the details. It's not important here. Here's the problem. Most of the conspirators are ethnically Serbian and are Serbian citizens. And Serbia is a country that is on the doorstep of the Austrian Empire, and they don't get along. Austria, however, the problem here is that the Serbians are ethnically Slavs, and the Russians feel that they are now the defenders of the ethnic Slavic groups. And it's a really weird deal because it's like an ethnic group, a sub-ethnic group defending of a greater ethnic group. It's really kind of strange. But what happens here is that Austria can't let this lie down. They have their heir to the throne assassinated. You can't let that go. So the Austrians basically give an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia rejects only one clause of the ultimatum. Everything else they actually agree to. But the ultimatum's a ruse anyway. They know that the Serbians can't agree to all of the positions, and so war is declared. Pretty natural stuff. Problem with that, Russia mobilizes because they have to defend Serbia. Their national honor is at stake because they can't let an ally go undefended because they're supposed to be like cultural brethren. So Russia mobilizes for war. Well, Austria's like, hey, you got my... It calls up Germany. It's like, hey, you got my back? Because if Russia gets in on this, we're screwed and you don't want us losing. Well, the problem is the Kaiser, jackass that he is, Wilhelm II, is, about to go on vacation right as this happens. And he's like, look, I'm sure you can handle it. If things get out of hand, we'll happily back you up, that kind of thing. Because he's not exactly the most competent ruler in Germany ever had, but he's not horrible. But his whole thing largely is that if the Russians have to tag in with the Germans, or Germany and Austria together, that's a fight that they know they can't win, and it's not something they want to get involved with. And so he goes on vacation thinking that it's probably just going to be solved, nothing has to be worried about. Problem is that as soon as, or not even before he can get back, the Germans start mobilizing because the Russians have started mobilizing to counter mobilization. Hey, we're all getting ready for war. Everyone get your game face on because it's time. Unironically, the deterrence measure is what kind of just escalates everything forward because Russia has an ally because everyone's scared of Germany, and that's France. Well, when Germany starts mobilizing, France starts mobilizing for war. And so the French are now drawn into this. And so basically, unless somebody says, all right, chill the fuck out, let's have a conference or something, war's about to be on because you have aligned sides, you have people that have vested interests in being a part of this conflict. It's go time. And so the problem is, show me your war face. Absolutely. No, unironically, that's literally kind of what we're at. This is the point where people need to make a summit, and this wouldn't be the first time they have it, to say, look, we need to get together, we need to hash this shit out, but here's the problem. Austria can't back down because, again, heir to the throne is killed. So there's just pretty much no answer that comes from them. Russia, if Austria doesn't back down, the Russians have to be involved because their national pride's at stake, and they can't back down. So these two are already on dock to say there's going to be something here. Germany and France can back down. They're not in a position where they have to get involved here, but they're going to support their allies because basically geopolitical balance of power. Germany doesn't think Austria can beat Russia, and that's probably true. And by what happens in the war, they are correct in that. So if Austria and Russia do go at it, Germany has to get involved. And of course, if Russia gets involved and stays in the war, then France has to get involved because they will lose to the Germans. So there's a guaranteed geopolitical chess match here that has to go down or everybody has to stop. And the problem is that it just really can't. There is some calls to have some summit or to have a summit. There's some calls in diplomatic channels for the better part of a month and trying to wind this thing down before it gets off the rails. Some people are a little bit more successful than others, but the long and the short here, Austria, Russia, can't back down, won't back down, and the problem just largely falls into this. Everyone's going to get involved. Okay, there's two powers here that we got to mention real quick that are important. Number one is Italy. Italy is technically a member of the Central Entente. They're supposed to be allies to the Germans and the Austrians. However, in attacking Serbia, Italy is not, what's the word I want to use here? They're not talked to. There's a word here. It starts with a C. I can't think of it. But anyway, they're not talked to, and part of their treaty is that anytime the Austrians are going to go into the war into the Balkans, Italy gets basically at least a seat at the table, or they get to participate, because Italy has a vested interest in their national security in expanding into the Balkans and securing Illyria. They're already pissed off because of Bosnia, but part of the treaty is going forward. But since they're not even asked to about Serbia, Italy's just like, nope, screw you guys, I'm not helping you, I'm out. And basically, Italy just becomes a neutral power. Could have signed on. They have vested interests in everybody in the region. They don't like the French too much. They don't like the Austrians too much. But Italy has a pretty good relationship with Germany because they are the people that helped get Venice back from the Austrians. So largely it is between Italy, or Italy's relationship is largely between the Germans and to some degree the British. And we'll talk about the British here. The British really have no vested interest in this fight. Their main concern is that no one on the continent gets too strong to where the balance of power gets completely out of whack. The problem is that methodology was under Napoleon, and that thinking has kind of changed. The British now look at themselves as a sea-going naval power. And as long as nobody questions that on Europe anymore, they don't really care that much. Here's the problem. The Germans have been questioning that to a large degree because the Germans decided that they wanted to build out a massive navy to openly counter the British. Their big thing was, hey, you have an empire? We want one too. And that didn't bother the British nearly as much because everyone was playing the imperial game. Hell, Italy was even in on this. Germany had colonies, Italy had colonies, France had colonies. What the thing that pissed off the British here is that Wilhelm had openly stated that they were openly building a navy to oppose the British in a knockdown, drag-out fight. Well, what is the best way to piss somebody off not to be on your team? Do exactly that. Because here's the problem. The Germans strategically and diplomatically screwed up here. And if Otto von Bismarck had still, been listened to or, still had been alive, he would have told Wilhelm that this was a stupid idea. The reason why is this. The primary rival that Britain had during this time wasn't Germany. They didn't horribly care too much about Germany until they started building a navy. The people they cared about was Russia. In fact, the British did have an ally in the world, and it was to oppose the Russians. And that was Japan. So being the new kid on the block, largely British interests were actually aligned more with the Central Powers because they didn't like France. They hadn't gotten along for the better part of 800 years. They had fought a war only 6 years earlier, unironically with the French, to stop the Russians. And they're allied with Russia's major competitors. So honestly, going into this war, the Brits are kind of on the wrong goddamn team. But this is where diplomacy and geopolitics matters, is that the Germans openly antagonized the British when the British actually should have been brought into the fold and it should have been sought out as an ally. And this is a critical failure that will probably cost, actually no, it openly will cost Germany the war. Okay, so that's everybody in Europe in a nutshell. We'll get to the extremist powers going in here shortly. War kicks off. Now, for a while, the British aren't quite sure what they're going to do because they're afraid of the Germans, but they also don't really care for the Allied powers, actually. What happens is that the Germans initiate the Schlieffen Plan. And the Schlieffen Plan was a flanking maneuver into Belgium to get into northern France and basically outflank all the French forward possessions in the area that was between France and Germany. Pretty good idea. Problem. If there was anything that the British didn't need, it was another reason to get involved. And the British, one, had a protectorate agreement where they would protect Belgian independence in case France or Germany invaded. So basically the whole thing was this. If Germany and France got to war and they went crushing into each other, fine. Let them bleed each other to death. But if anyone invaded Belgium to get to one another, France, or basically the Brits would join the side of against the attackers. So if France invaded Belgium, then they would declare war on France. If Germany did, then they declare war on Germany. Good job, Germany. You just literally sealed the deal. So after that, within the period of it's about a month after the war starts, the United Kingdom or Britain declares war on Germany, and they join the Allied powers. Going on with what's going on in the rest of the war, or in the rest of the world, is that everybody largely mobilizes and the war kicks off in late August and early September. The Austrians are the first ones to make an offensive, and this is obviously into Serbia. The Serbs beat their ass, and it's hilarious. The Serbians are a minor power. They're not even a regional power. They're a minor power. They've got a small but proficient military. They're doing okay. They're okay as a normal thing. But the Austrians just basically say, charge. We're gonna, we'll hit them with a little bit of artillery. We'll swarm them with dudes, and the war will be over, here in a day. Yeah, this didn't work out very well for them. And I do see chat blowing up a little bit, so I might address a little bit of that. there's some levels where I don't agree with some of the things that are being said, but some levels I won't, or I'll tag here. What's being said about the Austrians not liking Italy? Absolutely true. I think I addressed that pretty well. The part about Russia and Germany, no. Okay, so yes, absolutely true. So the Serbians are really pretty competent, and Marco Mouse actually is correct on this one. What had happened for the better part of the last 5 years is that the Balkans had basically been a cesspool of social strife and civil war between all of the minor powers that had emerged out of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And so you had literally 2 Balkan wars that happened right before this war starts, where you have... I can't remember how this all works. The second one is where Bulgaria jumps in and jumps everybody and then gets their ass kicked. The first one first one's where everyone jumps in and kicks on Turkey. And that is Greece, Bulgaria, and Serbia, and I think there's one other, like Montenegro or whatever, jumps in to help basically end the Ottoman presence within Europe. And they succeed. The problem is the Bulgarians are like, oh, hey, everybody else is exhausted. Let's go at it. And they declare war on everybody else. And they get their ass kicked. Whoops. But the Serbians are competent. Serbians are experienced. And the Austrians are not. And the Austrians will go into Serbia thinking they can just basically wipe the floor with them. And they get the crap kicked out of them. Okay, cool. So that's the opening phase in the Balkans. The next phase will be in... largely will happen in France and in Russia at the same time. I'm going to hit the Eastern Front. The Russians mobilize for war, and they're actually a lot quicker at it than a lot of people expected. And they'll invade the places of Western and Eastern Galicia. We'll just call it Galicia for the time being. These are the areas of very, very far western Ukraine today and southern Poland. And hell, even most of this area isn't even part of Poland anymore. Excuse me. But anyway, the Russians invade there quicker than anyone expects, and they send the Austrians into a rout. Surprise, surprise. They also invade Prussia with 2 entire armies. And the Germans are kind of outnumbered here because most of their forces are enacted in the Schlieffen Plan in France. We'll get back to that. What happens here is that 2 war heroes, Paul von Hindenburg and what's the other one? Is it Ludendorff? I can't remember. I think so. What they'll do is that they are going to use a very tried and tested tactic. They're going to keep all of their forces in one bunch, and they're going to go after one army and then go after it and defeat the other one. And in a nutshell, it works. Number one, the Russians have terrible radio communications and terrible radio security, so the Germans almost know everything that's going on within the Russian order of battle as soon as they start talking about it. So Germans have an intel bonus, absolutely, and they use it to the full advantage. So they go after one of the army groups, they defeat it decisively in pitched battle and basically destroy it. And then a couple days later, they'll reposition, and they'll pretty much do it again to the Russians, although there is some level where the Russians will retreat that army as well. But to a large degree, the Germans just completely whip the shit out of the Russians. And they will go on the offensive towards the end of 1914 and push into Poland. They'll also have to spend quite a number of their troops down to Austria to help shore up their defenses because Austria doesn't perform very well through most of the war. Okay, finishing out 1914 in Europe is that you have most of the German army try to go through Belgium and outflank the French army and come in from the north. This succeeds to a large degree. Now, here's the problem. It doesn't succeed fully. It doesn't take Paris. They get to literally the outskirts of Paris, the suburbs, but the French are literally take the entire taxi service of Paris, and they conscript them, and they literally rush troops to the front on the most basic roads you can possibly find in taxis. Literally 2, 3, 4 dudes at a time, just rushing them to the front. And they are able to stem the tide. They have the British come in and try to help with the British Expeditionary Force. And they're able to basically push back the line to some degree, and it locks down into trench warfare. Here's the problem for the French. The majority of the land that the Germans took, Miracle on the Marne. I don't think it's the Marne. I think it's the Miracle on the Seine, I think is what it is. Don't remember. But what largely happens is you do have more or less the miracle that largely happens. And what you have is that the problem for the French, sorry, I had to mentally get back here, is that 50% of the French war industry is in the regions that the Germans have now occupied. The areas around Alsace-Lorraine and very much northern France, right there on the Belgian border, is where most of the coal mining and steel foundries are within France. And so, while Germany hasn't given France the knockout blow, they've given them a very crippling blow. And it's actually one of the bigger discussions within World War I history and alternate history, is one of the reasons why the French perform relatively less effectively compared to the Germans is because their industry is largely knocked offline for the better part of 2 years, and they still have to import a lot of their materials from largely the Americans or from colonial possessions. And I think there's a lot of weight to be had here. It really takes some time for the French to really mobilize for war, economically speaking, because most of it's just taken offline. And even the Germans will use some of that materials to fund their own war machine. So the Germans kind of make a strategic victory even among itself. So 1914 ends. There's stalemate on the Western Front because everything's now locked down in trench warfare, and basically machine guns are a pain in the ass. You have the Balkan Front, which has sent literally the Austrian Empire effectively in retreat, and you now have not necessarily a stalemate, but an even fight going on the Eastern Front, as Austrian armies are basically whipped out by the Russians, but the Germans come in for the counterattack. Moving into 1915, the war is going to expand. There is two major things that will happen relatively in short order. The first one is that, I might have the order wrong here, but the Ottoman Empire is going to join the war. They're going to join the war on the Central Powers. The reason why the Ottomans joined the Central Powers is because basically everyone that the Central Powers are fighting, the Ottomans hate. They don't particularly care for the British. They don't particularly care for the French. They really don't care for the Russians. And they really hate all the Balkan states. So that's kind of a natural fit for them. Absolutely jump in. Because they don't like the Austrians, to be sure. But the wars between the Ottomans and the Austrians ended over 100 years ago. So to a large degree, they're okay with this. And Germany, they actually have a pretty decent relationship with. So kind of makes sense. They'll largely join the war, and they will absolutely... They don't perform very well, in a nutshell. I want to take issue with that, but let me do that in the after show or the AMA. So remind me to come back to some of these notes, because some of them are good. Some of them I want to take issue with. Okay. Anyway, going ahead forward. There's a level where he's kind of right and there's not. I'll address it here because it is point enough. Okay, the problem with the French army going into World War I is that I disagree that they're not industrialized. There's some problems here. The problem with the French military is their doctrine, and it's called Elan. And what Elan means is basically the spirit of battle. What they actually believe in is that they're going to go in to battle in brightly dressed uniforms. They're going to maintain the spirit of the French army, and they're literally just going to charge for king and country, or not king and country, but for the Vive la France. It's a very offensive, very morale. Excuse me. Okay, I can go with you on that part. Anyway, it's a very morale-driven kind of thing, and it's a little bit in response to what had happened with the Franco-Prussian War and whatnot, is that they think the lesson to learn from that war was they need to be offensive. They need to push the fight forward, because it's not what they do during the Franco-Prussian War, and they get their ass kicked. This time they want to do it. Problem: machine guns. Yeah, and so largely what you do is you see the French go into the opening stage of this war, sending hordes of troops, very similar to what they had done for the best part of 400 years with line infantry, but the game has changed, and German machine guns, particularly the Maxim machine gun, just mows the living shit out of them. It's bad. It's really bad. And so, in a nutshell, that addresses France. Okay. 1915, the Ottoman Empire joins the war, and they launch a couple of offensives. They do help put pressure in the Balkans, but it's not really enough to knock out Serbia. They largely run operations against the British and the Russians. The Russian campaign absolutely goes to shit. because they basically launched an offensive in the early spring, and it's still cold up in the mountains of Georgia, and they just literally most of their troops freeze to death and die. Of course, this is also the time where the Armenian genocide is going to start too, but I don't want to get into that, but obviously bad things happening. The other campaign that they're going to launch is a operation to capture the Suez Canal from Britain. This is a incredibly intelligent move, and it almost works. The problem is that it doesn't, and that's because the British basically send every emergency force they could possibly send within the empire to stem the tide. And had the Ottomans actually succeeded, that would have done not necessarily a death blow to the British Empire, but it would have been crippling, because that means today it's 10 extra days to go all the way around the Horn of Africa. Back then, probably 20. And so, wouldn't have been a knockout blow, but it would have hurt British lines of communications to India, and that is a pretty big deal. The Ottomans have a point to play in this war, and they definitely have something to gain out of this. They can start taking back some serious territory where and how they want to, and they can become a Middle Eastern power again. They've got some problems, though. Okay, the other thing that will happen this year, largely I think it's about mid-year, is that Italy is going to join the war. But they're going to join the war on the Allied powers. The reason why is that they don't really trust the French, they don't really trust the British, they don't really trust anybody in this particular setup. Yep. You're absolutely correct on that. Okay. Yeah, the Italians don't really like anybody except for the Germans. We already talked about this. The reason why they will side against the Central Powers is that openly both sides will say, hey, Italy, join us, we'll help you out. They didn't trust the Central Powers because even though they have a good relationship with Germany, is that they feel like Germany betrayed them in honoring the pact of the Central Entente anyway. And so they largely just like, all right, cool. We've got a history that the Central Powers don't really respect us anyway. The Allies might give us something. Turns out the Allies won't give them much of anything either. But welcome to life, Italy. It sucks, doesn't it? Anyway, to bring this full circle, Italy will join the war. They will launch an offensive against the Austrians. And just to show how bad the Austrians can be, or I'm sorry, not the Austrians, the Italians can be here, is that they'll actually get the crap kicked out of themselves when they go charging in the mountains with Austrians having machine guns. Now, that being said, the Austrians won't perform very well either, and they actually do have to send for reinforcements from Germany for a little bit until they can figure out how to make that work for them. But if anyone actually proves to be competent, or the Austrians ever prove to be confident, it's against the Italians. So I don't know if that's an indictment against the Italians, but it kind of is an indictment against the Italians. Okay, cool. Eventually what will happen here is that the war largely becomes a stalemate in the southern front. It becomes a rolling attack in the southeastern front. Basically the Germans come to back up the Austrians when it comes to Serbia, and they start pushing pressure in. And the Austrians are going to start learning some things, and they'll prove confident, and they'll start pushing in on Serbia. The Ottomans really don't get in on this fight because they don't really have a good border. What will eventually happen, and I believe it's at the end of the year, is that Bulgaria will join the war. And with the assistance of the Bulgarians, at the end of the war, Serbia and Montenegro will be decisively defeated in the better part of 3 months. Problem is, eventually Greece will join in too, but that's a whole other story. So, come the end of the war in 1915, you have Italy, stalemate because it's in the mountains, and mountains and machine guns do not mix well for offensive operations. You have, we're not talking about the Axis? That's World War II, sir. Okay, the Southwestern Front is largely becoming a Central Powers victory, and largely is wrapped up by the end of 1915. The Western Front, I think it might too, but it doesn't look very good. Okay, the Western Front between Germany and France, and obviously the British are here too, is largely stalemated because the line, while being quite long, has millions of men on it, and it's actually a really dense line. no one can find a really good place to break through. The topography is largely suited for defense in most of these areas. It's very hilly, very wooded. Basically, a war maneuver just can't be forced here. But what largely gets into this is the Russian front, the Eastern Front. This has a lot of back and forth during 1915. You will have the Russians siege and take Przemysl, which is a major fort within Galicia, and basically take it over for the better part of 3 to 6 months. And eventually, the Austrians are looking really, really sketch. But the Germans will redeploy forces from the Western Front in the during March and April because of the fact that they know they can't get any further. So they'll move them to the Russian front. And they're having a lot more competence and a lot more movement on the Russian front. One, because it's a huge theater. But also, in the regards that they're having success. And so the German army realizes that they can hold the line with less troops in France. They can pull their forces off, or at least some of them. They can send them to Russia, and they can actually decisively defeat the Russians again and again and again. When 1915 is over, the Russians will control most of Poland, and they will push most of the Russian forces out of Galicia. Yeah. And so that ends 1915 in a nutshell. Just to talk about what's going on in chat, why would America join, I assume, the Central Powers when what Anglo elites from America were descendants and relatives of the Anglo elite in England? Because they hated the English. Remind you that most of American history was to this point, was actually having a very bad relationship with the British. It was only in 1890 that in the Venezuela, the Venezuela debacle, that the Americans actually have any kind of positive relationship even to start with the British. A lot of people didn't think that they had a strong siding with the British. It was very much an instance of 1812 over again. Do we side with this European power or this European power? Because we don't really like both of them. Two things make the deal here that'll eventually kind of change the game. Number one is and the other thing I will mention is a lot of American citizens do come from Germany. Germany of ancestry, number one is English in the United States at this time and now. Number two is German. And so no matter which way they side with, they're afraid, the American leadership is largely afraid that somebody's going to get pissed. So they're not very interested in joining the war. The problem that you get into that changes the name of the game is, one, the Americans largely will start siding with the British and the French to sell them weapons because they can't do it to the Germans because of the British blockade. So even as an indirect action, the British kind of force the measure of having the Americans side a little bit more with them, even though it's kind of an act of war. The second thing that really hurts here is that the Roosevelts, for some reason, really were never big fans of the Germans. I don't know why, but that's a thing. And I guess that goes to the ruling class that you guys talk about. But everyone was always a little bit more cautious of the Germans when it came to the American leadership. And I don't know why, because if you think about it in a geopolitical context, Germany and America have a lot in common here. They have a really bad hit. They've got a poor relationship with the British. American strategic influence actually disaligns with the British. This is the era of time where people still want to annex Canada. By the way, can we bring that back? Anyway, yeah, there's actually people that are like, no, let's side with the Germans. Let's go invade Canada. We can fucking wipe this shit out by Christmas. There's a lot of political conversations going on about who's going to join which side, and there's no right answer here. What eventually will happen is that the economic interests start tying in with the Allies, and eventually the Americans will join. One, because they're basically allied collaborators, and two, you have the Zimmerman telegram, which we'll get into that, which looks like it's already been talked about in chat. So yeah. Other things that we'll mention before we get to 1916. I think this is in 1916, but don't quote me wrong. Japan and China is going to join the war. I don't think China actually joins until early 17, but eventually at some point, it's not really relevant because they won't play much of a role, but Japan and China will join the war to snatch up German colonies in the far Pacific. The Truk Lagoon, Northern Oceania, to a large degree, is going to be taken over by the Japanese in a swift action campaign because the Germans can't defend it anyway. And China's going to take back some of its possessions within China that had been taken by the Germans and other imperial powers, and this being particularly the port of Qingdao. Here's the problem. I said this earlier, I meant it, and I want to emphasize this again. Somebody's on the wrong side here. Because either the Japanese need to realize that none of the other powers in the region are really their friends, which they'll actually make that conclusion going into World War II, and that's why they're part of the Axis. Or the Chinese are like, wait, I've got like 3 German territories here, but I've got a bunch of French territories, and I've got a bunch of British territories. Let's knock them out. Let's get Hong Kong back. The reason why I think they don't do that is because Japan formally joins the Allied powers first, and they already had gotten their ass kicked in the first Sino-Japanese War. So I think I think China makes the wise move here. I think Japan doesn't. I think Japan actually probably should have been a nation that flipped sides during that war. Or not flipped sides, but they were on the wrong side entering the war. Because you had numerous imperial possessions throughout Asia at this point of British, French possessions that they easily could have gotten in on. Very similar to what they do in the opening moves in 1942, or 1941, 1942. But the difference here, is that you don't have an America openly at your throat at the beginning of the war trying to oppose you. And so the British are already stretched thin. You might have screwed up Japan. So whatever. Anyway, going forward is we're going to get to 1916 because almost everything that happens is going to be within Europe. Not to say that there isn't combat that happens outside of Europe. There definitely is. There's a lot of things that go on within shipping lanes regarding German U-boats, that kind of thing. And you also have the German territories within Africa that will be taken over. But to a large degree, that's a pretty big sweep because the Germans can't supply it. And outside of one of their colonies, they'll all collapse within a period of about 2 months. What will happen is that there is one competent German contingent in one of the colonies. I can't remember which one it is, but they'll actually last for the better part of 2 years before they're finally forced to surrender. Okay, going back to Europe, it's 1916. Now, 16 is the make or break year for most people, or at least that they think it's going to be. And everyone's got an offensive planned, and everyone is going to try to enact what they want. This is largely going to be the year of the Allies' offensive, technically, because they're going to get their offenses off first. What you have in Russia is that you have the Brusilov offensive, and they will put a lot of strength and a lot of competence into this massive attack across the entirety of their line to bring the entire Russian war machine to bear. And unlike the Soviet Union, this kind of has a lot of parallels. Here's the problem. The Russians just can't do it. It's not that they're openly incompetent. This is them at their best. And they do a hell of a number against the Austrians, but the Germans are there and they're in force, and they will counterattack in all the right ways, and they'll literally, by the time the Brusilov offensive is over, the Germans will counterattack, and they will be pushing into the greater areas of Ukraine and Belarus and into the Baltic states. The real issue here that the Russians have that they don't have during the Soviet era is that the Soviet Union had built out a huge industrial plant between World War I and II that it had made it from like one of the eighth biggest economy in the world, like 7th or 8th or 6th, to being number 4, and it was huge. Russia doesn't have this. Russia is in every nook and cranny at this point. They are a technological backwater and they're an economic backwater, and their system gets strained to the point they just can't persecute the war to the degree that they need to actually push back the Russian or the Germans and the Austrians, and they'll actually get pushed back themselves. If I remember right, what happens is that this is the German offensive, not around Metz, but it's the German offensive to bleed the French white. Largely what will happen here is that the Germans will 1 to 1.1 the French on this one, and they will bleed the French so badly that even though the Germans have a significant amount of casualties to their own, French morale almost completely collapses in 1916. And when they're actively told to go on the offensive, the French will actually have the biggest mutiny in all of their history. And for the better part of 1916, the French military, 1916 and early 1917, The French military is going to sit there licking its wounds, reorganizing how it works because their army almost falls apart. It's only whenever the Germans attack that they can actually mobilize their troops to do anything. Other than that, every time that they're told to counterattack or go on the offensive, basically everyone who is the level of captain says no, just ain't happening, dude. We're not charging into machine guns again. And so I'm skipping over a lot of this, but we're already at 54 minutes. So 1916 largely wraps up with the Germans more or less have not necessarily knocked out the French, but they bled them to such a degree. The French are going to spend the better part of a year just licking their wounds. Britain's largely competent, but Britain's all over the place trying to fight brush fire battles. I didn't talk about this in 1916. You had the landings at Gallipoli with the Anzacs. Largely what happens is British, French, and Anzac forces go into Gallipoli, which is just a couple miles from Constantinople or Istanbul. And they try to force the issue where they can knock the Ottomans out of the war and help supply the Russians. It doesn't work. They largely get stuck on the landing beaches, and for the better part of 10 months, they're stuck there, and eventually they'll evacuate in 1917. Is there anything else I want to talk about? The British will largely be able to hold off Ottoman offensives within Egypt that are trying to target Suez, and they'll push back a little bit, but not too much in the Levant. What really happens is that you have the invasion through Kuwait that starts going up the Tigris and Euphrates. I don't remember if this is in late 16 or 17, but you'll actually have one British army get surrounded and will be captured, but they'll redouble their efforts, and going into 1917 is that you'll start seeing victories from the British. So we'll start there first. Going into 1917, and actually start in Mesopotamia, is that to a large degree the British and the Ottomans are struggling it out. The British will have evacuated by mid-17 from Gallipoli, but what they do is they reshore their efforts into the Mediterranean and Mesopotamia. And so you have one army coming up the Tigris and Euphrates that will eventually take Baghdad by the end of the year, and you'll also have this guy named Lawrence of Arabia help get local resistance fighters on top of the British army to push the Ottoman armies back, and they'll largely take the areas now known as Israel or Palestine. They'll largely take by the end of the year, and this is the point where the Ottomans are almost functionally collapsing at this point. They can't really, the Russians can't really push the Ottomans can't really push the Russians, and it's actually the British that are doing most of the work here on this front. Getting into, where is it, anywhere else? I apologize. Getting back to Russia, this is just a year for the Russians to just absolutely lose. A lot of their most productive areas as far as food production has already been taken over. The Russian economy is grinding almost into the point of collapse. And so the Germans will actually largely make gains substantially throughout 1917 on the Russians. The problem is that for the Russians, they're just basically falling apart. The Germans can't commit enough to hit a final knockout blow, but they can actually take troops off the line, move them back to France to help support offensives in France, while also taking ground within Russia, because it's just largely a piecemeal effect where a little bit does a lot. And so 1917, to a large degree, on the Eastern Front for them is just fight, take some ground, fight, take some more ground, and just keep pushing the envelope further and further into the heartland of Russia. Excuse me, I cannot talk. Italy is, if I remember right, this is the biggest Central Powers offensive into Italy, and they'll actually break the line against the Italians. This is German and Austrian troops will do this, I think, in the summer of 1917. And it scares the living bejesus out of the Allies because they almost take Venice. It takes literally the rapid deployment of French and British troops into Italy to stem the tide. And you'll literally have a three-way coalition there opposing a two-way coalition. If I remember right, 1917 will end in Italy in a large degree with the Central Powers having finally gotten into the plains and being able to really prosecute offensive operations in Zest, but they don't have enough forces to really push that front in a particular manner that will absolutely knock Italy out of the war or give them another front that they can get leverage on people. Because This is where everything really starts moving into the Western Front. So, the Germans, as I already talked about, will move more forces back into this area in 1917. They are not necessarily continuing the offensive that they had in 16, but what they are doing is that they are basically trying to figure out what ways can they push forward in a constructive manner that will break the lines. So they're bringing in more troops, they're bringing in more talented people, they're bringing in heavy-ass artillery, and they're trying anything and everything that they can, including chemical weapons, which had already been had for quite a bit, but this is where they really start letting the chain off. Anything and everything is on board for the Germans at this point, and they try everything. And they almost just effectively break the French army, and it's only the fact that the British are there, along with very few American forces arriving from the United States joining in. So let's talk about the United States. What happens? At this point, in April of 1917, the Americans join the war. Why? One, they've economically tied themselves at this point to the Allies by giving them loans and giving them weapons and building out their industry to help out the Allies. But the other thing is this. The Germans are trying to get a leg up on the Allies, and they basically have written off the Americans as being Allied collaborators. So, who hates the United States in America that actually could do any kind of damage to them? Mexico. Mexico still is very upset about the Mexican concession of 1846 to 1848. So they would love to take it back. Germany knows this, and they send them a nice telegram. Hey, your army is not in the best state, but I promise you, if you do this, we'll probably win the war, and we'll be able to guarantee you a wonderful thing at the peace settlement. Whether they would honor it or not, I have no idea. Mexico just openly would have turned it down. The problem is the message didn't even get to them. What happens is the British control all the telecommunications cables across the Atlantic. They intercept it. They don't even let it get to Mexico. And about 3 weeks or 6 weeks after it's originally sent, there's an incident between the Germans and the Americans again. I think it's a U-boat thing again, right? Some ship is sunk, pisses off everybody. And the British are just like, hey, we have this message from the Germans to Mexico. You might want to read this, buddy. Basically, everybody in the United States hears about it, and everyone gets pissed. And largely, the support for helping out the Germans completely collapses, and the Americans largely side, all right, cool, we're going to join the Allied powers. Absolutely screws over. Absolutely screws over what they want to do. Mexican government was controlled by Germans at one point. I don't know anything about that. It was controlled by the French at one point, but the Americans openly told the French if that was going to stay, they were going to go to war. But that's in 1867. Okay, cool. Going forward with this, 1917 ends with with the Germans largely having pushed forward in some really good ways, but their allies are starting to crumble across the board. The other part of this is that the Americans have joined the war, and the one thing you don't want is a massive great power with a huge economy that has largely been unscathed from the war joining the fray, because all they're going to do is get stronger and stronger and stronger as the war goes on. Here's the thing that happens. 1918 is obviously the make-break year, the true make-break year. And it could have gone either way, truthfully, in all actuality. Here's what happens that goes really well for the Central Powers. In 1917, they bring a guy named Lenin back into the Russian Empire, and he's the guy of communism, right? They smuggle him through Finland. He starts ranting and raving, and they have two revolutions. One is in March of 1918. Was it not March of 1918? No, I'm sorry. These are 17. I should have tried this year. I'm off a year. In March of 1917, there is a revolution that deposes the Duma, or deposes the Nicholas II, and institutes the Duma, which is already a thing, but they become the central government. It's weak, it doesn't work well, and basically this is one of the reasons why the Germans are able to just march almost without reservation or without resistance into Russia. Germans into Russia, yeah. They'll put up some resistance, but they just can't haggle it. After 6 months of this, the basically the political instability is still very much there. There needs to be a more of an iron hand that comes in, and the Soviets, the people that will eventually be known as the Bolsheviks or the communists, what have you, staged a revolution of their own, and this is the October Revolution, and this is where Lenin and the Soviets come to power. When this happens is that the tone completely changes. Their whole thing is, we're getting out of the war, we're going to look after our interests, and, excuse me, yeah, I'll answer that here in just a second. October Revolution happens. You have you have a committed government that's going to say, hey, look, we're going to look after our own interests. We're going to get out of the war. All these areas that the Germans are occupying aren't even Russian anyway. Who the fuck cares? And to a large degree, in the spring of 1918, getting into this on the Russian front ends. The Soviets just openly say, hey, we're the central government. We don't like these areas that you run anyway. We'll give you the whole damn lot. Everything of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, you can have it. We're gonna make our communist utopia because we're in the midst of a civil war. It works. And the Germans basically are able to knock a major Allied power out of the war. Cool. Okay, so let's talk about Marco's thing. What's going on in 1918 is that the Ottomans are basically on the retreat or on the defensive. They are losing in Iraq. They're losing in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia and Iraq. They're losing in the Levant. Yes, that's true. But with the Russians out of the war is that they can actually redeploy forces that were in a blood match and start fighting. The problem is that at the exact same time, the Ottoman economy and the Ottoman political system just completely goes to shit. And they basically just break down in a civil war themselves, and you have the rise of Ataturk and whatnot. This being over doesn't really hurt the Germans that much because they weren't really helping that much anyway. So that's not too much of a problem. The next part, Austria. Austria losing this one's bad. This one really hurts. But this isn't until more towards the middle of the year or the end of the year. And I'll tell you why this matters in the beginning of the year. When Romania joined in 1917, they got absolutely raffle stomped and they were occupied. But Greece, at one point or another, and I think it's actually back in 1916, had joined the war, but it's very mountainous in northern Greece, and so neither side could push forward throughout the better part of 17. When the Ottomans start collapsing and you see all these other fronts start basically rolling up, the British and the French deploy forces into Greece and they start rolling back the front. They start rolling back the front in the Balkans, and all of a sudden the Austrian Empire, which isn't supported by the Germans down in the south, starts getting rolled back. Even with the Bulgarians and having no real threat within the region, they can't hold this massive Allied tide. This is a problem. The problem is, the reason I don't think it matters is because this is already largely after the spring offensive of the Germans has failed. And so this isn't the make or break point, because it's already a little too late. It's a little too late for the Central Powers to actually make the difference. 1918 in Italy sees the Allies also redeploy forces here and push the Central Powers back to the starting line. That's neither good nor bad, but again, towards summer, is that the Austrians will basically start rolling back, and they'll effectively scoop. And the reason why is the Austrian political system literally just goes to shit, and more or less before the war is even over and officially called done with, Austria is no longer a functioning entity as an empire. Largely, the Ottoman Empire, the Austrian Empire collapsed. Here's the big deal. This is where everything goes to shop, and this is the make or break month. In spring of 1918, this is where everything comes down. The Germans deploy everything that they can onto the Western Front, and that's redeploying everything from all these other residual areas, such as Italy, such as the Balkans, and such as Russia, and they put almost all of their deck into into northern France. The reason why is that they know that this is the time where they have to get it right, because if they don't, The American forces are going to keep rolling in month by month by month, and it's like something on the order of like 150,000 American forces every single month arrive. And so they have to do it now. What they don't know is that the Ottomans and the Austrians are about to collapse as a functioning entity, but if they get this right, it might not matter, and it probably wouldn't matter. If they can if they can functionally break the line and they can actively knock out the British armies within France, they can knock out the French as a functioning entity of themselves, which the French are kind of on their last leg at this point, and the Americans, before they actually can get here in force, if they can put France out of the war, the British lose most of their military. The Americans don't have any place to land unless they're going to go to England, and the French are no longer a functioning entity. War's over for it, because while the Germans, will be exhausted by this point, the Allies are going to be in a horrible situation. And even with the counteroffensives in 1918 that destroy the Ottomans and destroys the Ottomans and destroy Austria, the Germans can absolutely redeploy against these isolated areas, and they can invade Italy from multiple fronts. The next year is the German year. They can absolutely just wipe the floor with the Allies in these more localized areas, to the point where Germany becomes the dominant of the continent. That's why this matters. That's why this is so important. That is the make or break here, is that if you can knock out France and you can do such a crippling blow to the British, which would have happened, and the Americans are going to be like, well, this sucks, and we just lost, a ridiculous amount of dudes. Britain loses 2/3 of its active military at this point, and France is out of the war. Who's left to stop you? Italy? No. So anyway, long story short, I think you're not wrong here, Marco Mouse, is that in a nutshell, if the Germans could have succeeded and ended France by summer, even with losing the Ottomans, even with losing the Austrians, is that they were in a position to effectively dominate the continent in Central Europe. They would have been able to knock out the Italians within a year or two. And the only real question, I guess you can metagame there, is would have the Allies dropped everything and anything they could, being largely the British and the Americans, to helping Italy? I don't think they would have. I think they would have called it quits, because losing all the forces in France would have been a crippling blow to the British army, and the Americans weren't invested enough to get to the point where they were going to be able to push forward. So I think that would have been the end game, and literally everything is decided within the period of 1 to 2 months within France of early 1918. Okay, cool. I don't know if there's any other things I need to really get into. There's a lot of stuff I glossed over, so if you guys have any questions or comments, there's 15 people that are watching the stream, so that's fantastic. I don't think that the Germans would have knocked out France if the spring offensive was successful. I can definitely see some reservation with there. I think they would have, but I think that was a gambit question. I think that was really an uphill battle, and of course they lost anyway, right? I think it was possible. The problem that they had is that they overextended a little bit in the wrong way, and they got hit with a French counterattack. And the one thing, the biggest what if is that if the Germans would have pursued tanks, because they had the option to in 16, but they thought, nah, we can handle these with heavy machine guns and long rifles and artillery. They were technically right. What they didn't think of was what happens when you have 300 tanks in a mass assault. And this is actually why the Allies are so proficient in 1918. Is that even with tanks being as unreliable as they are, and they can actually be taken out with basically heavy small arms, is that anyway, the tanks being knocked out with heavy small arms is that if you have 300 of them, even if a couple of them break down and a couple of them are knocked out, you can still send 100. You're still gonna have 100 tanks there at the end of the offensive, and they can cross trenches. They can break the game, and you see more Allied gain ground in 1918 than you see in all the war combined, and they'll literally roll the front line up all the way up to Germany by the November of 1918. I think I addressed the armistice part. If you deny France being the landing zone, it doesn't matter. Like, where are they going to go? England? Great. You're literally looking at a D-Day situation in 1919. I don't know. I don't think the Americans are going to be willing to invest in that. especially if the British have just lost most of their forces. But I'm not going to repeat that. That's fine. If any other questions from the chat, feel free to do so. And Marco, I do appreciate you being here, even though we don't agree on this. We have. All right, quick shout out to the West dude, my major patron who is in the chat, VIP. Gotta love. The French would have had to sign an armistice for that to happen. I mean, it really doesn't matter. Even if you sign an armistice, if Germany had broken the line and made it an offensive, made it an offensive action where they can move around and get mobile again, they could have literally the amount of territory they could take is most of France within a couple of months. Like we had seen to a large degree how proficient the Germans could be on a mobile offensive in Russia. I think if the line had formally broken, the Germans absolutely could have took out most of France in just a month. Granted, it's not what we saw in World War II, or quite like we saw in World War II, but it would have been enough to the Americans wouldn't have had a place to land by the time it was over. Yeah, okay, we agree on that part. I think what I'm trying to say here in a nutshell is that if Germany succeeds in its offensive to take Paris in the spring of 1918, is that the French and British armies would have been fundamentally broken, and they would have routed the Allies and took over most of France by the end of the year, which leaves 1918 just for the Central Power or Germany to clean up the shop. Yeah, so I think we're more on the same page than not. Good to see you, Techie Rod. Was it as mobile? No, you're correct on that. Here's the problem. Why was it not as mobile? It was the topography and the terrain that was the major limiter. Most of where the front line was broken down was very hilly or forested terrain. But if you get into Italy de France, you've got a lot more room to maneuver. And actually what we see consistently is when somebody made a breakthrough point in the area just north of Paris, there's a lot more movement. It's only when you get into the upper hills of northern France and into the, what is it called? Not the Ardennes, but the area that is the elevated point of Belgium and northern France, where the industry and the mining is. That's a lot harder to fight in. Street fighting in Paris would have been worse for nobility. No. The problem that we saw this in World War II, we saw this in World War I. Urban combat is only bad really in the modern era because people think, oh, hey, let's go send tanks down to Main Street. What? Lotharingia. Yeah, actually to some degree, although that's more of the Champagne region today. What nations would do, and we saw this during the Franco-Prussian War during this time, is that you would encircle a major city and then you would either just put it under siege or you would engage it. You would actually put very limited forces into the urban combat because it was a trap. You'd have to shell the crap out of the place. The Germans absolutely would have done that again. They would literally go for the maneuver option because that was actually their doctrine. And the reason why you get into World War II with the Germans having a mobility doctrine in a country that doesn't like oil or doesn't have oil is because the Germans had always emphasized, even during the Brothers' War of 1866, is that they have to engage people in a battle of movement and get the superior positioning to win the fight. And that's been part of the German doctrine all the way back since then. So I absolutely think that, to answer your question, it's harder to circle Italy to France. Yes, but I'm not really talking about just that whole region. Literally exactly what you saw during the Franco-Prussian War, I think you would have saw again. You would have saw the Germans break through. They would have encircled to a large degree the Allied forces in pockets. They would have sieged them down and forced them to surrender bit by bit by bit. And ironically, kind of a combination of what we saw during the Franco-Prussian War, but also what we saw during World War II. You're talking about the German-Franco War, the worst war before World War II? Okay. Sieges take months. Months that would be allowed for the Yanks to arrive. No, they really don't. At least not during this era. You got to remember that this is the era of like really fucking heavy artillery. I know this is going to sound contradictory because it's World War I and we had trench warfare. The thing that we normally see during this period of era is that you bring in some heavy howitzers, and unless you're in a really fortified position, such as the hills of northern France, you're getting routed because buildings don't stand up to this shit. You need concrete reinforced stuff. But I have grown tired of this part. Suffice it to say, we don't agree. Good to see everybody though. It's been absolutely fantastic, and I have enjoyed quite a bit about what was going on. But we're getting so much into alternate history, it's not even talking about what actually happened. So, in a nutshell, let's hit the outro real quick. Is that the war will end, and the war ends with 2 of the 10 great powers formally not existing anymore. Right? You have the end. You have the end of the Ottoman Empire as a functioning entity. It will be in civil war for the better part of 3 years before it's all said and done. You have the end of the Austrian Empire that will be formally dismantled by the Treaty of Trion, and it pretty much had disintegrated itself anyway before the war is even over. The Russian administration had been pushed to such a degree that it had been subjected to a revolution. The king had been overthrown, or the emperor had been overthrown, Tsar. And you had a revolutionary government in the form of the Soviet Union take form. And Germany is now forced into a democracy by the Allies. And you have a whole new rebalancing of Eastern and Central Europe with the rise of a new Poland and the Baltic states and what have you, to where Europe is fundamentally different after World War I than it is before it. And we can always talk about the treaties that are signed or what have you. But to a large degree, I'm going to counter the notion that the Treaty of Versailles was incredibly horrible and, basically guaranteed World War II. It was largely normal. Was it higher on the stakes? Absolutely. But you had just fought the biggest war in human history. There's nothing really out of bounds in the Treaty of Versailles that we hadn't seen as part of the norm for the better part of the last 40 years. And so getting into where this all ends is that World War II is inevitable. Even if you had a nicer Treaty of Versailles, Germany was not going to take losing World War I on the chin and just say, okay, well, we're done. They eventually would have gotten into a geopolitical conflict with either Russia or France, probably France, where the question of Europe had to be addressed once again. And so, to a large degree, going forward, is that World War I may be the Great War, it may be the war that was supposed to end all wars, but it didn't break all the players to the point that World War II does, that allows for basically the end of history, and that is the Americans taking over for everybody. But of course, if you want to know what my thoughts were on World War II, where you have that, and if you want to know what happens after that, we have a Cold War episode, which you can definitely check that out. So go check out all the wonderful things. Real quick, just looking over chat. Actually impressed. Okay, appreciate that. Sorry I had to read through all that. But anyway, yeah, Geopolitics has been fun stuff. I always like doing my history streams because they're at least decently popular and people like to talk and interact. And sometimes you guys have some stuff that I really like to comment on. I've gotten into the what ifs a little too much more than I like to, but in a nutshell, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you all here. I'm going to roll the outro. I'll have a little bit of it in a post stream if you guys want to have me any questions, both personally and professionally, what have you. But yeah, this is going to be the end of this particular Geopolitics episode. So let the outro roll, and I'll be right back. Have a good one, guys.